he's accusing China here of sinister election meddling. So getting involved, hacking into voting systems and obtaining the data.
He hasn't explicitly said the election was stolen, but he's even a couple of breadcrumbs there for people to kind of stitch together the point of what he's trying to hint at or suggest at.
He has been pushing for weeks now, longer, that the lawmakers should pass the Save America Act, which would mandate proof of citizenship in subsequent elections.
Hey guys, good to see you. This is an unusual situation because it is late night, as you might be able to tell.
Exactly. Bernie and I have just been on air for the last while, listening to the president and picking apart what he said, because he's made some pretty dramatic and serious allegations about election security, election integrity, the actions of foreign governments on US elections. And really, I think the impact of some of what he said is going to be quite massive. I will put the proviso in there that he has put a whole pile of declassified documents on the White House website that we are just starting to go through. It's going to take some time to do that. Actually, the White House website crashed. Such was the rush to try and see these documents that the president was talking about.
I think it's interesting because he brought up a lot of things that he'd brought up in the past, for example, foreign interference and the security of voting machines, and he presented what he says is evidence of all that having taken place. But what he didn't even really allege was that any fraudulent votes had been cast, or that there had been a sort of electoral outcome from, for example, China getting the personal data of American voters, or that the voting machines could, in theory, be manipulated, as he says they were in Venezuela. He made no claims that there was any real impact on previous elections here in the United States, which I think is kind of something that people will point out going forward.
And you know what? It's one of the rare speeches that President Trump makes when he doesn't say the 2020 election was stolen. That really jumped out to me as well.
Yeah, and there had been some anticipation that he might do exactly that, and that he might declare some of the elections, for example, in the state of Georgia, illegitimate. The two Georgia senators who won in 2020, they went on kind of a full court press on the media before the speech to make sure that they got their message out to say the vote was absolutely legitimate. But as you said, he didn't do that. And what I think is interesting is he's accusing China here of sinister election meddling. So getting involved, hacking into voting systems and obtaining the data. But as you said, Bernie, they don't make that link to actually influencing the outcome of the vote here, and that is significant. And we should also say that one of the claims that the president made in the sets of the reams of documents that he and the White House have released is also that there are non-citizen voters on voting rolls in a few states. They say around 250,000 of them, and that again is something that we're all going to be pouring through the documents to see what exactly is they are linking to there. But all of this, again, not actually expressly used to say by the president that the outcome of the election was rigged.
I think about the allegations that there were undocumented people that are registered to vote. I thought that was kind of one of the more pointed parts of his remarks, because he has been pushing for weeks now, longer, that the lawmakers should pass the Save America Act, which would mandate proof of citizenship in subsequent elections. And I think that he's using that kind of as evidence to try to push that through quite significant resistance that it's met in the Senate. And there doesn't, so far, it doesn't really seem to be much movement that'll take place. And I thought, that was quite an interesting linkage, because it ties to a policy that he wants to see implemented, which he discusses very, very, very regularly now.
Yeah, that was a direct bridge, I thought, to the Save America Act. And also, when he said 278,000, what was the word he used, non-citizens are on federal vote rolls, getting some immediate reaction from Republican and Democratic strategists. They're both saying if that turns out to be true and that's proven and that's in these documents, that's very significant. Because if you think back to some of the election wins and losses, not just at presidential level, but at all levels, sometimes the margins are tiny. They're in dozens, hundreds, or thousands. You know, even President Trump beat Hillary Clinton by, 117,000 votes in 3 states. So if there are potential irregularities of 278,000, that's quite a big deal. And, you know, we're saying, yes, he's not linking this to the 2020 election. But the point about the Chinese interference, he is saying began during the 2020 election cycle. So I think he hasn't explicitly said the election was stolen, but he's even a couple of breadcrumbs there for people to kind of stitch together the point of what he's trying to hint at or suggest at here. And he's also giving enough kind of problems there that people who maybe don't support President Trump's view, who aren't election deniers, can also say, well, hold on, if China managed to access, you know, over 200 million American voters' information, that's really serious on a whole other data breach level as well. You know, what are they doing with that information? But also what he didn't answer was, and I have it here, the National Intelligence Council report that came out in March 2021, which said that China had, you know, thought about getting involved in the election, but ultimately there was no evidence that China had interfered in previous election cycles.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. There was a US government intelligence report that was released precisely on this question. And I just pulled it up in front of me to look at exactly what they said. And the bottom line was, we assessed that China did not deploy interference efforts, and as you said, Katrina, considered but did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the election. And we have high confidence in this judgment. And interesting to see Virginia Senator Mark Warner, who's a Democrat, of course, he said, look, all of these claims in the aftermath of President Trump's address, all of these claims have been addressed already. We looked into this in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and these claims of China meddling are, he says, more or less bogus. So the Intelligence Committee, certainly on the Democrat side, are saying this is a question that has long been answered, and these are documents that have already been reviewed.
I think kind of importantly for the White House, from their perspective, they're not even necessarily looking at past elections, but I think their point in the coming days will be that if that sort of not interference, but infiltration of U.S. voting systems by the Chinese was possible in the past, then it very well in theory could be in the future, and China could take the other decision in future elections to actually use it for influencing the outcome of the election. I think in that sense, I think many Republicans and certainly the White House will see that as kind of forward-looking rather than backward-looking, a kind of a sign of what's possible rather than necessarily what's happened already in the future.
And that's what exactly the Democrats were warning about, weren't they, ahead of that speech, was that this is a sort of preemptive measure, a way of explaining away if Republicans do perform terribly in the midterm elections, that there's now this sitting gift there to say, well, can we trust the results? Can we trust the outcome? Maybe there was meddling here and interference like I've just outlaid in all of these documents, and all of these investigations are underway. And as long as you're sowing those seeds of doubt, that's problematic.
Something that's important to mention is that, when there were previous allegations of the possibility of elections being rigged, allegations made by President Trump, election experts I spoke to back in 2020, for example, said, look, you have to say that, of course, there are foreign actors, whether they be governments or non-state actors, that do try to influence or perhaps interfere even with U.S. elections, but those are being monitored closely. And most importantly, one of the U.S.'s biggest assets in its voting system is that it is highly decentralized. There's not one kind of federal voting system. Each state controls its own voting system. And then, you go down to the local precincts and polling stations. And because of that, it makes the U.S. election incredibly hard to interfere with. Now, influence operations are not the same as interference. And you could think about influence operations in the way that, you have certain bots or ads that you might see on Instagram.
And there is evidence of that having happened in past elections, a lot of it. And it's not unique to the US
And
either.
absolutely, that's an important thing to note as well. And influence doesn't necessarily translate to an actual impact on the election. That's an important kind of distinction to make.
And I thought it was interesting. He didn't really kind of make that. There was very little, if any, if I recall, kind of mention of efforts to sway public opinion. I mean, this was about the system itself rather than about broader. I mean, because one doesn't need to hack into a voting machine to, for example, have bots pushing a certain narrative on social media, and that kind of wasn't something that was addressed really in tonight's speech.
So where do things go from here then? I mean, if you look at how Democrats are reacting to this, they're of course saying precisely what you both touched on, which is how will President Trump use these documents that he says have been declassified? How will he use the statement when it comes to the midterms?
And I think that comes back to this trust issue and this undermining of that trust and undermining of those elections. He also talked about basically rallying all of the major agencies of the US to investigate what's gone on over the last few years, sort of setting up this notion of a deep state conspiracy and the American people having been lied to about for a very long time about how secure their election rolls are and their federal registers were. And, yes, that's pointing to the Save America Act, but it's also pointing to this just, if you don't trust the election process, then do people come out to vote? Do they bother to vote? Do they step even further back from mail-in balloting and then it's on the day at, turning up to vote in person? And you're creating already this kind of chaos around the ballot system, which is not healthy, I think, for a democracy. People need to trust in that, and people do trust in it. I mean, there is a high level of trust in the American security of their ballot system thus far. Exactly what you were saying, Sumi, about it being so decentralized. I mean, we know all about that from election nights, don't we? And we're waiting on different precincts in different states to come in, sometimes hours or days after others because of the different systems that they employ.
I think the real test will be, in his remarks, President Trump said that he had kind of asked that possible prosecutions and charges be brought against people he says were involved in these efforts. I think really once that information comes out and there's an indictment, for example, that'll be the ultimate test of whether people see this as something that's actually quite solid, or whether people accuse him, which I suspect some will, of kind of weaponizing the justice system to suit his narrative of what's happened in past elections and perhaps in future elections. I think those charges and the public reaction to them are going to be really crucial going forward.
There's also the accusation that this is a major distraction tactic. I've heard that from Democrats already as well. How many Americans are talking about election security? They would say they're not. They're talking about gas prices. They're talking about what's going on in Iran. How long are we going to be engaged in this war that at this point in time seems not only to be not being brought under control, but actually is in an escalation phase as well. And President Trump is trying to change the narrative, Democrats would say, by focusing on this. And, he is the master of the narrative, isn't he? And in terms of swerving around what people are talking about and what they're focusing on.
And this is one of the most important issues that really goes to the heart of what President Trump believes. He still makes those unfounded claims about the 2020 election. And for him, this is about, as he says, saving America. He said, if you don't have trust in the country, you don't have greatness. He started his speech that way. And that is why he's focusing on it. And, we see all these reports that some of his advisors were not perhaps as happy about the speech as they would have been had he sat down to talk about the war in Iran or the state of the economy, so on and so forth. And you just wonder how much of this will pull him away once again from that campaign trail that Republicans want to see him on ahead of the midterms.
And, in the last line of his speech, he says to people watching, call your representatives in the House and the Senate, demand that they pass the Safe America Act without delay. If all of this is about getting that piece of legislation passed, which kind of has looked doomed to failure at this point out, I mean, it's a big effort to go to, isn't it? Declassifying all of those files, putting them all on the website, if it's just to get one piece of legislation through.
That's how much he cares about this legislation, clearly. And he's talked about it nonstop. And remember, he held up that housing legislation because he wanted the Save America Act to be passed. And what senators continue to say to him is they don't have the votes to get it passed. And so you wonder, does this move the needle for the president?
And I think that's the big test at the end of this. I think that's the thing we'll be hearing, perhaps more so than any of the allegations he made about it. I think we'll be hearing from him directly about the Save America Act more than electoral security. I think those are very linked issues for him.
Mm. And whether people are indeed calling their representatives, putting pressure on them to put the vote through, but whether they call or not, we will be talking about it. I think it's almost time for bed here.
Let's get some sleep.
So, after our late night episode, we better all say goodbye, and I'll see you guys soon.
But next time during the morning, please.
Well, who knows? The news is the news, guys. Don't we know it?
Hi, guys.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then do like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we'd love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.